I'm Stacey Hynd. I'm from the University of Exeter in the UK. Okay, my research currently focuses on the issue of historicising child soldiers in Africa. A lot of the work that's been done on child soldiers is very much done from a legal, a political, and humanitarian perspective, and it tends to sort of make the argument that child soldiers emerge in the 1990s in the wars of Sierra Leone and Liberia, for example, and it presents them as these examples of the depoliticized, the criminalized, and the civilianized nature of so-called new wars in Africa, and it kind of can decontextualize the child experience. So what I'm looking at is trying to provide a longer term analysis of the ways that children have been involved in warfare throughout the 20th century and how their experiences and how the kind of the patterns of child soldiering have shifted over the 20th century. So within that, starting to look particularly at the roles of girls in these conflicts, because about 30 to 40% of children involved in the wars in Africa are girls, and thinking about how their experiences are gendered in these conflicts and what they go through. So forced marriage is obviously quite an important component of this for many women. I suppose with relevance to the current discussion here on forced marriage, the thing that really jumped out at me was when you look at the definition of the child soldier, which is formed in the Cape Town Principles in 1997, it actually states that forced marriage is explicitly put into that definition of the child soldier. So child soldier is not just a child who's carrying a gun. They very much understand that it's about children who are involved in other capacities in warfare, so being porters, being spies, being girl wives. And so I became very interested in why that idea of forced marriage had been incorporated into the definition of child soldiering in 1997, almost before the debates about forced marriage had really got going with the Sierra Leone cases in sort of 2008. So I think in many ways what's surprised me most is the way that humanitarian and legal narratives of forced marriage have sort of mapped onto each other, and the sort of the differences in the way that they approach this question of what forced marriage is, how children experience, how much agency the girls have within these institutions of marriage. And another thing that I've been looking at is why forced marriage is so often associated with African conflicts in particular. So does Africa have the worst forced marriage issue, or is this just something that is mapped on to wider concerns about Africa being this war-ridden conflict, and the fact that it's this wider kind of racialized narratives of Africa as a place of barbarity and sort of primitive ideas of child protection and women's rights, and whether that's sort of shaping the way that forced marriage is being discussed from a humanitarian perspective with relation to Africa. So, do we really have the world's worst problem of forced marriage, or is it just that humanitarian narratives bring this kind of racialized discourse of Africa to discussing this actual problem? I think what I found, certainly from looking at material on child soldiering, is that it's incredibly difficult to categorize. There is no set pattern of normal marriage. And if we want to understand this issue of forced marriage, we have to be very sensitive to both individual and local experiences of marriage and conjugality, in particular, and what we understand as being involved in the bargains of marriage, what a marriage actually constitutes. So one of the things that I've been looking at really is trying to understand what girls think that marriage is and should be, and how they actually try to sort of explore what we would call tactical agency within these forced marriages. So how they kind of bargain between each other with the other wives, how they bargain with their husband, with other soldiers, and try to find some form of agency and protection within these marriages. I'm very interested in looking at how this exploration of tactical agency maps onto experiences in a post-conflict setting in particular. So what happens when the girl is actually removed from the setting of warfare, goes back into the community when the war ends? How does her experience of marriage during conflict shape how she understands marriage outside and afterwards, and sort of what does she bring back from this experience of being a kind of bush wife or a war bride. So I think it's one of the things that we need to look at more, which hasn't really been explored.